What is burning down here right now cannot be replaced anymore, so it harms Russia a lot. More about this in the report. 15, 5.6.2025. We are in the 5th year and day 113 since the start of the full-scale invasion. Welcome to the Situation Report. In today's report, we will see a real defenestration. We will also take a look at what the consequences are when you can no longer really maintain things. And what we will also look at is the recent air raid on Kyiv, as well as much more. But just before that, happy Veterans Day. I can count myself among them as well. At this point, a big thank you to all our veterans who have often done great things in this country and, in my opinion, don't get nearly enough recognition. In Rostov-on-Don, Colonel Oleg Sokolenko, military commissioner of the Proletarsky and Pervomaisky districts, has died after falling from a window, according to Russian media. This time, it wasn't a euphemism. It was literally a fall from a window. Because according to the local portal block Nord Rostov, he was found unconscious and injured near his home under an open window in the middle of last week. He actually fell from that window. Later, he died from his injuries. Investigators currently believe it was a suicide. According to the report, a farewell letter was also found, in which he said goodbye to his relatives. However, he is not believed to have left an explanation for his alleged action. The reports have not been officially confirmed so far. However, the position of the military commissioner is now listed as vacant on the website of the Responsible Military Service Office. Sokolenko was responsible for recruitment, conscription, and mobilization in his area of responsibility, precisely those topics that have been particularly sensitive since the beginning of the war. What makes this story even more remarkable? In Russia, for years, there have been increasing cases where well-known figures from politics, business, the military, and administration fall out of windows or die under dangerous and unusual circumstances. Just in the past few years, there have been a whole series of such cases. Sometimes it was managers of large state-owned companies who somehow decapitated themselves because they also claimed it was a suicide. Sometimes it was oligarchs, sometimes members of the military, or even high-ranking officials. There were also attacks on high-ranking military officers, like the recent car bomb explosion in Moscow, or the e-scooter that also exploded and killed a general or an aide. Of course, in the case of Sokolenko, there is no evidence of a crime so far. After all, if it had been the Ukrainians, the Russians would keep it quiet, because that would mean a Ukrainian victory. If the Russians had done it, they would keep it quiet and call it a suicide. Actually, something like that happened here too. Or he actually just took his own life, which, if we look at the recent cases, now sounds pretty unlikely. Of course, we can't rule it out completely. Still, the news is likely to spark discussion in Russia, not just because of his role as a military commissar, but also because the phrase high-ranking Russian official dies after falling out of a window has now become an expression that automatically makes many people very skeptical. You might think that a video by Leontang was filmed in Crimea. In fact, this one is from the Moscow region. So the search for gasoline goes into the next round. And later, we'll take another look at what Russian military bloggers have to say about it, because now it gets extremely interesting where fuel is currently in short supply. But let's stay with gasoline for a moment. According to the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Navy, not a single oil tanker was handled through the port of Tuapse last month. The background is the repeated Ukrainian attacks on the Tuapse refinery, as well as the adjacent Rosneft site. Tuapse is, or rather was, one of the most important Russian export ports on the Black Sea until its destruction. Significant amounts of Russian oil flowed through this hub towards the world market. He even speaks of around 20% of Russian tanker oil exports being handled through this port. A burning refinery is making headlines. A port that no longer ships any oil still costs money. And not just a little, but a large amount of money that Russia needs for the war. Almost every other ruble now goes directly from the Russian state budget into the war or into armaments or the security apparatus. And if the largest Russian oil port on the Black Sea was practically at a standstill for a whole month, then that's exactly the kind of damage that causes much more of a headache in Moscow than any destroyed truck at the front. Because wars are not only fought with ammunition, they're also paid for with money. And every war is also an economic transformation. And in Russia's case, the most important source of income is the export of energy. After we've repeatedly seen images in recent years of soldiers moving forward in sewer pipes, drainage channels, or abandoned pipelines, there now apparently are even drills specifically for such operations. You have to give them credit for one thing. If a tactic is used multiple times or has even been successful on the Russian side at times, it eventually becomes part of standard training. For outsiders, it naturally seems a bit absurd. Other, more modern armies train for urban combat, airborne operations, or battles with the latest systems, while the Russians are apparently once again practicing advancing through sewer pipes. But, as we've seen in the past, except for the last major attack, this tactic of tunneling under Ukrainian positions has actually worked pretty well. Drones monitor large parts of the front, and any open movements are quickly detected and fired upon. That's why pipes are actually quite suitable, but we've also seen that in the past, the Ukrainians have simply stuffed them with barbed wire, or what they've also done is just mine them. Russia carried out another massive airstrike on Kyiv last night. According to monitoring channels, there were more than 25 missile launches and 7 Zircon hypersonic missiles, around 28 Kh-101 cruise missiles, as well as about 480 drones that were used here. These numbers alone show how the character of the war has changed. A few years ago, an attack with a few dozen missiles would have already been considered extraordinary. Today, we're talking about hundreds of drones and a mix of missiles from practically all the major weapon systems in the Russian arsenal in a single night. The Zircon missile is particularly problematic because it's one of the most modern Russian weapon systems, and it flies at an extremely high speed. For the people in Kyiv, this means yet another night in shelters, accompanied by sirens, explosions, and anti-aircraft fire. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like nights like these will become less frequent anytime soon. During the last major attack, Russia also hit the Monastery of the Caves, a place that holds significance far beyond Ukraine, because the Kyiv Monastery of the Caves was founded back in 1051 and is one of the oldest and most important centers of Orthodox Christianity. For the Orthodox world, it holds a status that can certainly be compared to other major religious centers. For decades, the site has also been a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that's exactly why this incident is likely to attract attention far beyond Ukraine. It wasn't just any administrative building, house, or industrial complex damaged here. We're talking about one of the most significant religious and cultural landmarks in Eastern Europe, a place that has survived wars, revolutions, the collapse of empires, and nearly a millennium of history. What makes it especially bitter is the Russian narrative that this war is supposedly being waged to protect the Russian-speaking population, the shared history, and the Orthodox culture, which they have just literally bombed. At this point, thank you very much for 75,000 subscribers. Just imagine that. That's an incredible number of supporters for this channel. Thank you for that. If you want to do a little more, feel free to become a channel member. I'd like to invite you to do that. There are a few benefits, and you'll be supporting the channel even further. In the Irkutsk region, at a secondary site, a Tu-22 M3 strategic bomber crashed during a scheduled flight. According to initial reports, the crew may have been able to eject using the ejection seat, but there is no official confirmation about their condition yet. The Tu-22 M3 is one of the most important carriers of Russian cruise missiles and has been regularly used for attacks on Ukraine since the beginning of the war. This aircraft is theoretically reserved for deploying nuclear bombs, making each plane extremely valuable. That's what makes this report so interesting. Russia still has a number of these bombers in its inventory, but they are no longer being produced. Every loss, therefore, permanently reduces the available fleet, regardless of whether the aircraft is lost due to a technical defect, an accident, or combat operations. In addition, Russian strategic aviation is already under enormous pressure. First, the Ukrainian Operation Spiderweb, in which several strategic aircraft were damaged or destroyed at Russian airfields. And now the next loss due to a crash. which probably could have been prevented if the planes could be maintained, but that's hardly possible due to the sanctions and the pressures of the war. Of course, an accident is something completely different from a successful attack. But in the end, it makes no difference for the Russian Air Force because a crashed Tu-22 M3 can no longer launch cruise missiles. And that's the problem. The Russian long-range fleet isn't getting bigger, it's getting smaller, slowly but continuously. Once again, one of many Russian tanker trucks has been destroyed in a Ukrainian drone attack. This time, the drone was apparently operated by the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Service, HUR. So it's another sign that by now, not only specialized drone units, but practically all branches of the armed forces are carrying out such attacks on Russia's most important supply route. The attack took place east of Melitopol, so clearly behind their own front line. Several Russian military bloggers report that in parts of the Donbass, there is no gasoline available at all in some areas, and along entire stretches of road, gas stations are said to be empty. At the same time, Russian soldiers complain that they are no longer allowed to fill self-procured fuel into barrels. And this is the point where the story becomes interesting for the military. A tank without fuel doesn't move anymore. A truck without fuel is basically just an obstacle on the road. And a drone unit without fuel can't run its generators and can't charge the drones anymore. Because that's what many people forget, they're also dependent on fuel. That's why we've recently seen some surprising recommendations from Russian channels. Volunteers heading to the front should bring 20 liters of gasoline instead of cookies or sweets. That sounds more like a partisan group from the 1940s that has to be supplied by the civilian population rather than the army of a state that calls itself the greatest energy superpower. I also found the statement of a Russian blogger particularly telling, who basically asked how it was possible in a mechanized war to have problems specifically with fuel production, storage, and supply. Well, of course, we know where these problems come from. They don't arise on the Russian side because they cause them, although indirectly that's actually the case. But they come directly from the fact that kinetic sanctions are working very well, and we see burning depots every week, and that's exactly the point. Russia doesn't have too little oil. Russia is sitting on huge oil reserves. The problem is that oil in the ground simply doesn't matter to anyone. It has to be extracted, processed, transported, stored, and distributed. And this exact chain has been under attack for months. For the people in Crimea, this now means waiting times of 12 to 20 hours for 20 liters of gasoline. For Russian soldiers, it means that fuel suddenly becomes something you have to organize instead of just getting it easily. And if that already means the same thing for the army as it does for civilians, then you have a big problem. And when soldiers start to see gasoline as a more valuable take-home item than food packages, that says much more about the situation than any official statement from Moscow, if there will even be one. Thank you to all subscribers, channel members, and the Algo crew. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Renee Kessler, Dietrich, Freddie, and Mai Meyerhofer. Subscribe, like, comment, and until the next situation report.